Walk around New York today and you will see many glorious statues, some to commemorate an important event, others to draw the eye to the magnificent building the figure belongs to, and there are those that exist purely to decorate the urban landscape with beauty. If the sculptures were created in the 1910s, there is a good chance all these aforementioned types of statues have one thing in common: their model, the almost entirely forgotten Audrey Munson. In her heyday, it would have been unimaginable that her name would go unremembered, swept away by the sands of time into the realm of the many abandoned stars of the bygone. In those days, she had many other names besides the one of her birth. She was Miss Manhattan, the Exposition Girl, American Venus, and the perfect model. The flame of her stardom burned brightly, but as they say, the flame that burns the brightest is the quickest to go out. Today we will explore how New York's brightest star fell so tragically from fame, and how she spent the rest of her 104 years when the spotlight had moved on. Audrey Marie Munson was born in 268 State Street, Rochester, New York, on June 8, 1891, to a humble background. Audrey claimed both her parents had distinguished ancestors and that her father was even descended from a baron. Her father, Edgar Munson, was a real estate agent, and her mother, Kitty, was a second-generation Irish immigrant. Audrey, however, claimed that her parents' marriage united one of the finest Irish families with the English. Her parents' ambitions towards greater things may have inspired the same feelings in their daughter, who in later years would call her birthplace of Rochester the dirtiest little town, despite not having seen it in decades, and evident in her ancestral delusions of grandeur is the desire for a greater position in the world. She went on to be a passionate advocate for women's rights, but agency and justice in her own life was often robbed from her, regardless of her ideals. This family sense of ambition ended up destroying her parents' marriage, with her father often far away working in the West, trying to make his dreams of being rich come true, while Kitty stayed at home. In 1899, when Audrey was 8, her parents divorced after Edgar Munson was accused of infidelity. He went on to marry the other woman, Cora Cook, while Audrey's mother Kitty was granted full custody of her. The pair moved to Providence, Rhode Island, where Audrey entered an all-girls school and learned to sing, dance, and act. Not much else is known about her childhood, and with the exception of one ominous event, it all seemed to be quite uneventful. When she was 5 years old, a mass of travelling Roma people descended upon East Syracuse, attracting quite the crowd with their young Queen Eliza. Audrey was taken to see them by her mother and had her palm read, and for the rest of her life she believed the fortune that was told to her was a curse. You shall be beloved and famous, but when you think that happiness is yours, its Dead Sea fruit shall turn to ashes in your mouth. You, who shall throw away thousands of dollars as a caprice, shall want for a penny. You who shall mock at love shall seek love without finding. 7 men shall love you, 7 times you shall be led by the man who loves you to the steps of the altar, but never shall you wed. As classically dramatic and foreboding as can be expected from a soothsayer, much of this would come true. Audrey was too young to fully take in those words at 5 years old, but as she grew up, her mother repeated them so much she would never forget what she had been told of her future. In 1909, Audrey and her mother moved once again, this time to Washington Heights, New York City. This move opened up a whole world of opportunity to the 17-year-old blossoming beauty. And like many others before and after her, she was lured in by the glamour of Broadway. It is very likely her mother pushed her towards the stage, and in later years she had certainly lost any childish fantasies of the glamour of life as an actress. With perhaps an undertone of bitterness, she said all one needed to be a chorus girl was an ability to learn a few mechanical dance steps, smile a mechanical smile, and walk mechanically in a mechanical line. She became an actress and chorus girl, her first part being very small in a play that ran for less than a month at the New Amsterdam Theatre, but other roles soon followed. Audrey might have been forgotten entirely, consigned to be just another chorine, forever on the sidelines had it not been for the photographer Felix Benedict Herzog, spotting her peering into the shop windows on Fifth Avenue, dreaming of the day she could actually afford to go in them and buy the hats she was admiring. Herzog was an electrical engineer and patent attorney with a passion for photography and other art forms. He had connections among the art community in New York, and after inviting Audrey to pose for him in 1909, he introduced her to some other photographers and artists. As a member of the National Arts Club and formerly the president of the Camera Club, Herzog knew all the right people to give the beautiful 17-year-old a great start to her career. And so Audrey Munson was lifted from obscurity. It was not long before she began to model for sculptures. One of Herzog's acquaintances gave her a letter of introduction to the sculptor Isidore Conti, and it was for his statue The Three Graces she received her first modelling credits in the very same year of 1909. Conti insisted she pose nude for the statue, an idea to which her mother was initially opposed. But the sculptor reassured both mother and daughter by saying, "To us, meaning artists, it makes no difference if our model is draped or clothed in furs. We see only the work we are doing." The statue was placed in the lobby of the Hotel Astor, where all of New York's high society could gaze upon her lovely and nude form. After that, there seemed to be an endless stream of jobs for Audrey as a model for all kinds of artists, even posing for Charles Dana Gibson, though her main work was always as a sculptor's model. Once again, she might have had a better life if not for another twist of fate. Herzog was to become the first of the 7 men foretold to lead her to the altar. He proposed to her, and she seemed to have every intention of accepting, but then, on April 12th of 1912, he died after a surgery. For Conti, Audrey had been convinced to pose nude for the first time, but it most certainly would not be the last. Her father disapproved of her career choices, but was pleased she could live off her own money instead of his. Her mother was in full approval of her daughter's career, having always encouraged her to chase fame in all its artistic forms. Audrey herself quickly came to see nudity as natural and liberating, although she was paid only 50 cents per hour for it. She went as far as to say, "Clothes ruin us. They do harm to our bodies and worse to our souls." Artistic and high society circles regularly mix, and in the society Audrey moved through as her career took off, women wore heeled leather shoes a few sizes too small and tightened their corsets to achieve the fashionable look. In light of these trends and the opposite views on clothes the bohemian artistic set had, her harsh words are more understandable. Like many other artists' models, Audrey believed women's fashions should be more natural and freeing, although it is important to note these impractical trends were only the norm in fashionable society. Most women's corsets were not drawn in tightly, nor did they wear shoes of the wrong size. The gypsy curse faded into the background of Audrey and her mother's minds for these years of success. The rising star was indeed beloved as the fortune-teller had said she would be. She was nicknamed Miss Manhattan as her perfect figure appeared all over the city, keeping watch from the skyline as goddesses and angels, and observing Manhattan society pass by as a fountain or monument. Wherever one went, you couldn't escape her form, personifying the Beaux Arts standard of beauty. A career high came in 1915 when Audrey posed for the Walking Liberty $half. A new mint director, Robert Woolley, became convinced that coins had to be redesigned every 25 years. A government competition began, and it was the designs of Adolf Weinmann that won. Weinmann described himself as an architectural sculptor, but is better remembered as a coinage artist. He had worked with Audrey a few times before, and she was chosen as the model for the Walking Lady Liberty on a coin that was circulating long after she was forgotten by the world. In the same year, Audrey was the model for 3/5 of all the sculptures at the 1915 Panama-Pacific Exposition. She was now towering above 2 cities, New York and San Francisco. 2 new nicknames arose in the year of 1915, the Exposition Girl and the Panama-Pacific Girl. It is ironic and fitting that the city she adorned the most was one of illusions, with a grandeur that suggested it was an ancient city and not just a temporary display. Yet despite its beauty and magnificence, only small, faded remnants of it would survive after the crowds moved on. Audrey was indeed the Exposition Girl, the personification in her own life of what the Expo was, a grand but temporary show of beauty and art, to be torn down and forgotten as quickly as it had risen. She was a more recognizable figure than ever, and her newfound fame opened up another avenue of career opportunity. And so she stepped into the film industry, still in its youthful years, in 1915's Inspiration. It has been said she was the first woman to appear naked in a mainstream film, but an earlier film, Hypocrites, actually beat her to it. In a bemusing reverse of what we see today, Audrey performed herself in all the scenes where she was in the nude, and a lookalike was hired to act for her when she was not. It is probable that this was not her choice, and despite her artistic views on nudity, it is possible this strange arrangement was made in order to bring in a crowd with the allure of a famous model bared for the world to see, but still not have to pay her for the entire film. The movie was clearly made for her and looking to capitalise off of her success. Its plot concerned a sculptor's model, and as her nudity was presented as artistic, censors had quite the headache on their hands if they attempted to ban it, as they would also have to ban many great works of art alongside it. The following year, Audrey, followed by her mother, made the move to Santa Barbara, California, to make another film, Purity. Once again she cast off her clothes, and in certain places the film was banned. As a result of her first film Inspiration, the National Board of Review, which made its business finding out what films should be censored or not, had tightened its rules concerning nudity. They recommended 10 scenes be cut from the film. Some places complied, others did not, and it was the completely uncut version that was rediscovered in a French private collection in 1993, making Purity Audrey's only surviving film that we know of. To get an idea of just how long Audrey's life was, a fact that becomes more tragic the further we delve into her story, that film came out in 1916 in her heyday and was a box office success. It was considered lost for decades, and yet its star was still alive, 3 years away from her death when it was found in 1993. Audrey made another movie while in Santa Barbara, The Girl of Dreams, and then she and her mother took a train back to New York. After this, one can see a sudden decline in Audrey's career. Her modelling credits become few and far between, and the release of her third movie, The Girl of Dreams, appears to have been held back or possibly not released at all. Perhaps the cause of this was the continuing controversy surrounding Audrey's previous 2 films, which were still being shown and the censorship argued over. She may have only been paid 50 cents an hour to bear herself completely, but with the steady stream of work she'd been having for almost a decade, she had enough money to pay her father back on a $50 loan, and in 1918 she was reported as being among a growing number of celebrities who owned a Hudson Super 6 car. Around this time, Herman Ulrichs Jr. came into her life. He was said to be the richest bachelor in America. His father was a steamship multimillionaire of German descent, and his mother Teresa was a rags-to-riches silver heiress, who had become one of New York's 3 leading socialites, along with Alva Vanderbilt and Mrs. Fish, after the retirement of the Mrs. Astor. Ulrichs Jr. had been all over the press a few years before in 1913, for crashing his car and stabbing a chorus girl named Lucille Singleton. According to Singleton, Ulrichs had become enraged and started stabbing her with a sharp object after she had told him she had a dinner engagement with another man. He had taken both hands off the wheel and ended up crashing the car. Singleton was approached by people working for Ulrichs, offering her money to drop the charges or settle out of court. She reported this and it got into the papers, but soon after changed her statement and dropped all charges against Ulrichs, claiming suspiciously that the excitement of the car crash must have made her remember incorrectly. Despite this, to the Munsons, Herman Ulrichs Jr. seemed quite the catch. Audrey had grown up 35 miles away from the Ulrichs' so-called summer cottage of Rosecliff, which Teresa Ulrichs had hired famous architect Stanford White to design. It is possible that Audrey and Herman did actually become engaged. Audrey's mother Kitty maintained throughout her life that Herman and her daughter had married, but there is no evidence of this whatsoever. He visited Audrey numerous times, and it appeared that they became very close. It would not have been in the realm of fantasy for Audrey and her mother to dream of such a marriage. Chorus girls and models had married millionaires before. In the case of the famous Florodora Sextet, every one of the beautiful stage stars had married into wealth. But Audrey had so much controversy attached to her name that it is likely the Ulrichs family, who by this point were well established in polite society, did not wish to welcome a nude model into their ranks. It seems Audrey was dumped, and she soon found out there was a rival. Edith Mortimer, a beautiful socialite, was a perfect choice for Herman. She had money behind her name, and her father encouraged her to make a good match into American wealth. In the end, Herman did not marry Edith either. He married an actress and heiress named Dorothy Haydell. Audrey, however, had come to hate Edith Mortimer and Ulrichs with a passion. She extended her malice to their whole families, who she became increasingly convinced had plotted against her to ruin her career. Her meteoric rise to fame after poverty and sudden decline had taken its toll on her mind, which may have already been fragile. Her hysteria worsened, and in 1919 she wrote a lengthy, rambling letter to the US House of Representatives, where she claimed Herman Ulrichs Jr. had been responsible, along with the Mortimers, for the collapse of her career. Herman had stopped her last movie, The Girl of Dreams, from reaching theatres, and he was part of a German plot of some kind to end her career. She also claimed both the Ulrichs and Mortimers were Jews, and said there was a Jewish plot against her. She begged the House of Representatives to protect her from the Hebrews, who had apparently stolen millions of dollars from her. All of this was entirely ridiculous. The Ulrichs and Mortimers weren't even Jewish, they were Catholic and Episcopalian. Anti-Semitism was a popular viewpoint at the time, as was a hatred of Germans after the Great War. Audrey imagined some of her enemies were even funded by Kaiser Wilhelm. Her mother did nothing to stop her daughter's delusions, even urging her on in them. Audrey wanted to go to England and move her career there, and believed Ulrichs was spreading rumours of a pregnancy to damage her. To me it seems Audrey, now approaching 30, couldn't take the loss of her career, which had been so prosperous but a few years ago, and Ulrichs leaving her. Her hopes had been raised by various other men, but all had come to nothing in the end, just as the gypsy had foretold. In another sign of her poor mental state, she began to call herself a baroness, and preferred to be called Lady Audrey Munson. But worse things were yet to come for her in that same year. Audrey and her mother were living in a boarding house owned by a Dr. Wilkins. As well as being their landlord, Audrey later said Wilkins had been her medical advisor. It is possible the pregnancy rumours were true, and she was perhaps seeking to end it, or she may have even had a child in secret and had it adopted. Many decades later, well into her old age, Audrey's younger half-brother Harold visited her, and she asked if he was her son, leading her relatives to question if she had had a child somewhere along the line. Whatever the case may be, Dr. Wilkins was developing an obsession with Audrey that culminated in him killing his wife Julia, so he was free to be with the beautiful model. He claimed he was deeply in love with Munson, and to avoid further scandal in the court case, Audrey and Kitty fled New York. They were searched for in a highly publicised nationwide hunt, and refused to return to New York even after being located in Ontario, Canada, where they were subsequently questioned. Audrey vehemently denied being in any kind of relationship with Wilkins, who was found guilty and sentenced to death, but hanged himself before the sentence could be carried out. The final nail in the coffin of Audrey's once shining career had been hammered in. Soon after the trial, the American Film Company informed Audrey that there were no upcoming roles for her, and so she and her mother travelled the country looking for work in many major cities. But Audrey was approaching 30, and the artist's studios turned her away. Moving back to Syracuse, a year later it was reported that Audrey was working as a ticket girl in a museum that was showing a statue of her, while her mother was selling kitchenware door to door. Audrey gave an interview in late 1920, explaining why she had begged the newspapers to print news of her death. She said she wished to move on from the name Audrey Munson, that if she died to the world, perhaps she could move on and start again as a new woman. The reporter found her thin, pale, and nervous. Her apartment and her person both showed clear signs of the destitute state she had been reduced to, now that even shops wouldn't hire her to be the girl behind the counter. In 1921 it seemed Audrey had put the hysterical writings of the past behind her, and although still deeply depressed, she wrote 20 articles that were serialised for Hearst's Sunday magazine, entitled The Queen of the Artist's Studio. A very different Audrey emerges from these writings than from her erratic letters. She gives us a fresh insight into her world, and that of all the many nameless faces and bodies that have contributed so much to the world of art. But perhaps this newfound clarity was not hers at all, as these weekly instalments were ghostwritten by a man named Henry Gates. This same man gave Audrey another chance to tell her story when he wrote the film Heedless Moths, based upon Audrey's articles. The film was met with more controversy as once again Audrey appeared naked, and once again a double was hired for her actual acting scenes. The double, Jane Thomas, infuriated Audrey while on the press tour. While Audrey made a few appearances at theatres showing Heedless Moths, Jane was doing most of the engagements pretending to be Audrey, and worse still, it was the film company's idea. Audrey sued the company and producer Alan Rock, who was added to her growing list of enemies, for $15,000 in damages. She also revealed she hadn't been paid the $27,500 salary promised, and the claims of it were just for publicity. Heedless Moths was to be her last film. In the summer of 1921, Audrey declared she wanted to get married and conducted a highly publicized search all over America for her perfect man. In August, she called it all off, saying she didn't want to get married after all. While in St. Louis promoting a reissue of Purity, now called Innocence, Audrey and her manager were arrested on a morals charge due to Audrey's nudity in the film. The pair were quickly acquitted, and Audrey went back to appearing at showings of the film, striking her poses for the audience. Her mental health continued to deteriorate. In the May of 1922, she swallowed poison in an attempt to end her life, but was unsuccessful. A week later, she declared to the press that she wanted to live, but had been so overcome by her troubles that she hardly knew what she was doing when she took the poison. She tried to work on the stage again despite disliking the long hours, low pay and late nights. She got a few jobs, but one day, while in a bathing suit in her changing room, a man she described as powerful in Broadway grabbed her, and she shouted at him that she would rather have a snake slide over her than be touched by him. The man was aggravated by her comments and stormed off. Suddenly, the play Audrey was in was shut down, and no more roles on the stage followed. She was blacklisted. For the next decade, Audrey effectively disappeared. The next notable thing in her life occurred in 1931, when her mother, being unable to take her daughter's mental state any longer, had Audrey committed to a mental asylum on June 8th, which happened to be her 40th birthday. She was sent to the St. Lawrence State Hospital for the Insane, and with the exception of a short stay in a nursing home, she would spend the rest of her 65 years in this facility. Whenever she could, Kitty would visit her daughter, whom she cared for deeply, but after her mother's death in 1958, Audrey would have no visitors for over 25 years. When Audrey was 93 in 1984, she was discovered by her niece Darlene. Darlene was the daughter of Harold Munson, the youngest child born of the second marriage of Audrey's father Edgar. Harold was born in 1918, just as his elder sister's mental health began to deteriorate. And while he had heard stories of her, it seemed nobody in the family was aware of her fate or whereabouts in 1984. Darlene did some digging and made the shocking discovery that her aunt was still alive and in her 90s, having spent over 2 decades without contact from the outside world. Not knowing what to expect, Darlene and her father visited Audrey, still stunning even in her 90s, with pale skin, white hair, and a surprisingly sharp mind. They had brought her chocolates and a stuffed animal toy, as that was what they had been told she liked. When she saw Harold, she asked if he was her son. This was the beginning of a relationship that lasted until her death on February 20th, 1996. In her last years, Audrey was loved and annually visited by her family, whom she was buried next to in an unmarked grave to protect her privacy. And on what would have been her 125th birthday, June 8, 2016, she received a headstone on her grave. And so comes to an end the fascinating and at times tragic life of Audrey Munson. I will leave you with a quote from the woman herself, from her Queen of the Artists Studios articles. "What becomes of the artist's models? I am wondering if many of my readers have not stood before a masterpiece of lovely sculpture, or a remarkable painting of a young girl, her very abandonment of draperies accentuating rather than diminishing her modesty and purity, and asked themselves the question, where is she now, this model who was so beautiful?"